Hello and welcome to the KPI Institute's webinar, Secondary Benchmarking, Is It Worth the Time? My name is Andrei Kostia and I will be your host for today along with our presenter Alina Mirtoiu. This webinar is part of a series of free educational materials that aim to enhance the knowledge and know-how of those interested, while also creating a bridge between us as a company and you, our public. The KPI Institute is a research organization specialized in business performance. It operates research programs in 12 practice domains, each linked to a certification course, ranging from strategy and KPIs to employee performance, and from customer service to innovation performance. The KPI Institute continuously builds on its values of best know-how, data, and facts, and common sense to achieve its mission of integrating performance as a discipline through research, publications, and, what interests us today, through educational programs such as this webinar. Today, 13 years after the KPI Institute was created, we can proudly say that our products have reached professionals in 5 continents, and that our public comprises a worldwide community of 73,000 members online and 28,000 registered companies on smartkpis.com. Today's webinar will teach you all about efficiently deploying a secondary benchmarking initiative and making sure it has the desired outcomes. And it will be delivered by Alina Mirtoiu, a benchmarking specialist at the KPI Institute. She is a certified benchmarking professional and KPI professional and is the director of the Center for Performance Benchmarking. As a research analyst, one of Alina's most significant research programs focused on developing a benchmarking study in the utilities sector for 3 major utilities, water, gas, and electricity generation, which comprises worldwide data. As an educator, Alina delivered in 2017 the Certified Benchmarking Professional course, both as in-house in Romania and as an open house course in Dubai. This presentation lasts for approximately 45 minutes. Please feel free to ask any questions you might have during the webinar, as they will be answered at the end of the presentation in our Q&A session. Enjoy the KPI Institute's webinar, Secondary Benchmarking, Is It Worth the Time? Now I would like to invite Alina to begin her presentation.
Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you, Andrei, for your presentation. Thank you all for joining, and I do hope you will enjoy today's webinar. We have made it to the 4th webinar of the series, which, unlike the other 3, based on particularities of different utilities industries, will tackle a more general theme, which is secondary benchmarking. There is a general idea in the market that a secondary benchmarking study is not as good, to put it this way, or as it doesn't bring as many benefits as a primary one. So people don't usually use it. I would like to discuss with you today, this idea and why a secondary benchmarking could actually be a good idea to use in practice, and to see if there are enough benefits in order to worth the time and resources invested. Now, why secondary benchmarking? It's because in 2016, as Andrei already mentioned, the KPI Institute, through its Center of Performance Benchmarking and its Utilities Lab, initiated a large-scale project, Utilities Performance Benchmarking Report Series, which is a secondary benchmarking initiative, and we considered the secondary benchmarking approach to be the best one. And it contains 6 reports revealing the most common KPIs monitored by utilities companies worldwide, and also presented their performance results to enable our readers to benchmark their own performance. The utilities we focused on were water, gas, and electricity. I'm only mentioning this because we will use the example throughout the webinar. And for each utility, we had 2 different reports, one with non-financial KPIs and one with financial KPIs. Now, based on the experience we acquired during this initiative and our past experiences with secondary benchmarking, today we will talk about this as presenting the overview process, presenting some differences between secondary versus primary benchmarking, and some benefits when deploying a secondary benchmarking, as well as challenges when doing this. So during the webinar, we will discuss the KPIs approach and we will explain the steps we actually used and why we chose to use those precise steps for secondary benchmarking. I will have some practical recommendations for you, and here I will also need your involvement for the 2 polls that we have created. And of course, we will have some do's and don'ts when working with secondary benchmarking data. Now, let's start with the process overview and the terminology in order to get acquainted with this before going into a more in-depth discussion. So, what is benchmarking? According to Dr. Robert Camp, which is one of the pioneers of benchmarking, this is the search for industry best practices that leads to superior performance. So basically, you just search for the best practices, and you will, by employing them into your organization, this will help you lead to superior performance. This is quite a very simple definition, but there are a lot of other definitions for benchmarking. And if you can see here, Australia Manufacturing Council, Spendolini, Fine Art Wealth Management, and so many other publications try to define benchmarking as well as and as complex as they could. But if you take a look at these 4 definitions listed here, we can see that all of them, or most of them, see benchmarking as a continuous and systematic process, which is implemented in order to lead to superior performance. Now, the part with ongoing and systematic is actually a new process. It's a new part comparing to Dr. Robert Camp's definition. And this process is implemented in order to lead to superior performance of an organization, and is based on best practices, as Dr. Robert Camp also mentioned, found within one's industry or even outside their industry. So you are not bound of benchmarking only within your own industry, but you can benchmark outside the industry as well, as long as this gives you enough knowledge in order to improve your own processes. And what makes secondary benchmarking more special then? Why is it more special than, let's say, a normal benchmarking or a primary benchmarking? It is a type of benchmarking which basically has the same characteristics. It's still a systematic process. It's still implemented to lead to superior performance. It can highlight specific relevant aspects, such as top performing companies, such as industry trends or performance gaps. But this type of benchmarking research is deployed by conducting comparison studies between already available performance data without directly contacting your benchmarking partners. So basically, you can gather the data without having to have any contact of any sort with the company you're benchmarking yourself against. And it basically has the same the same benefits, but the data is already available. And as you can see on the screen now, this benchmarking study, just as the primary one, it gives a company the opportunity to compare its performance against competitors. It does, of course, because you can gather the data of your competitors very easily. It highlights best and lowest performance levels, and this is also true, as the data you gathered, which is already available, can show you which one performs best or lowest. It highlights performance gaps, and as mentioned, it gives the opportunity to learn from the leader's experience in order to determine its own strengths and weaknesses. And it can also help you create a baseline from where to measure the improvements or set your own targets. Although we're talking about primary or secondary, so the advantages are the same. Now, this being said, let's revise together the main steps of deploying a study, a benchmarking study, be it primary or secondary. And then we will discuss on the example followed by KPI, as I already mentioned, when we deployed our secondary benchmarking initiative within the utility sector. What I would like you to keep in mind at that point is that there is no single best methodology to be used, but you should try to choose a methodology according to the complexity of the study you are making and the expertise of your benchmarking team. However, there are a few general steps common to every benchmarking study, and those will be the one presented today. So obviously, as you can see on the screen, as in the case of any project implemented, we need to start with the preparation phase, in which the needs are established based on an internal analysis. The problems you are trying to find an answer for are going to be defined, and you will select your team, the team that is responsible for the project, in this case, a benchmarking team. Usually, the benchmarking partners are as well chosen in this step, but as we will see later on, when discussing about a secondary benchmarking study, the benchmarking partners initially selected might not be the ones you will, or might change based on data availability, which is an important aspect. So once all these are established, we are starting the data gathering phase. Now the benchmarking team has to set the indicators or the processes they need to benchmark based on the problems we defined in the previous step. We need to establish the collection method and collect and prepare the data for the analysis. So mostly in this step, we are answering questions like what or how, and what will be benchmarked, and how will the data be gathered, along with the actual data collection and setting the database, just preparing the database in order to have it for the analysis. Next step, as you already might have guessed, is the data analysis phase. Now the data, which is already prepared in the previous step, you have, let's say, as it was our case with utilities, we had a large database with performance levels for a lot of companies, since we had hundreds of companies to analyze, actually thousands of companies to analyze, and the results of all of them for 5 years. So you can imagine we had a really big database. So that was split per industry, per financial, non-financial, in the data gathering phase. And it was prepared for the processing or for the analysis. So the data prepared in the previous step is analyzed using statistics in order to highlight performance gaps or best practices. Better say, to show the company where it stands against its benchmarking partners, against the industry level, and what needs to be improved. Based on this, the improvement initiatives are formulated, are implemented, and you are obviously interested in monitoring the progress and the results in order to make sure that the improvement initiative you formulated during this phase are actually working in practice and are bringing improvement and are bringing better results for your company, which is the fourth and final phase, improvement and implementation, as we call it. I am very curious to see what do you think to be the most challenging of these 4 phases? And I would like to start the poll now. Andre, if you could please help us with this. I would like to see which one of the stages presented, so preparation, comparison, analysis, improvement, and implementation, are more challenging for you when, or you consider to be more challenging when deploying a secondary benchmarking study. So we will take about, let's say, 30 seconds to answer this poll. Let's see. So what do you consider to be most challenging or the hardest thing to deploy? If you think about a study where the data is gathered only through available data already, without having any contact with other organizations. Is it preparation, comparison, analysis, or improvement and implementation? Okay, so let's say we will take about 5 seconds. Good. So the poll was closed now, and the results are that everyone who voted comparison phase. So do remember this result for later. This is very interesting. And now, also thank you for answering the poll. And now let's discuss the steps the KPI, our team from the KPI took when deploying the secondary benchmarking. And what we did was to start with business understanding. Of course, this was a new industry for us. So as an initial stage, we started with aiming to understand the industry, identify potential benchmarking partners through the world. So, for example, for the water industry, our study of our output for the business understanding part was to find 1,048 water potentially eligible companies to be included in our study. And as the selection criteria, we only used exclusively industry affiliation. But you can also, of course, you could also use some other criteria for choosing this. But our main goal, it was only to understand the industry, to see how many companies there are, and how the geographical area they cover, and so on. Now, the second step was data collection. For us, this was the most intense part of the research, as it consisted in gathering data for all potential benchmarking partners. Metrics, performance results, they were collected from publicly available data sources, of course. And in our case, the sources were mainly the official websites of the companies, and included 3 types of documents, which was annual reports, sustainability reports, and financial reports, covering the data for 2011 to 2015, which was our goal. As an important factor in data collection, the language barrier and the metrics reported were the ones that actually led to a big shrinkage in the dataset list. The next step was standardization, which is, in my opinion, and I will tell you in the last part of the webinar why, is one of the most important steps which can assure the success of a secondary benchmarking study. And it mainly consists in reformulating the names, making sure, identifying the similar duplicate KPIs, making sure we have the same unit of measurement, and so on. Now, the data analysis and clustering is the fourth step. Here, all metrics were split into clusters in our case. We created 5 clusters for the purpose of the study, which were customers, operation, environmental impact, corporate governance, and human capital, according to what the KPIs actually measured. We didn't use statistics a lot because we wanted to showcase the most common KPIs and to show the performance levels. But of course, we also wanted our readers to be able to benchmark their own performance as well. So we only showed the data we found from the raw data we found. Data visualization was another important step because we made sure that all the data for one metric or and so was for different companies was aggregated and displayed in graphics. And given the complexity of the study and given the number of years we chose to work with, this step was a bit complicated for us because we wanted to make sure that all data is displayed correctly. And the data visualization representation we used was the histogram, given the need to display, again, various metrics, the result over the years for different companies in the same chart. But if you're only having few benchmarking partners and you are having the results for, let's say, 3 years, it shouldn't be that complicated. However, I recommend you to use the histogram. The next step was data accuracy review. We wanted to make sure that the data we gathered and the data we used was actually accurate. So to ensure high reliability, the data was double-checked. The data we actually used was double-checked again in the initial reports. The next step was report consolidation, report writing. And of course, this stage consisted in aggregating all graphics into one comprehensive report. And now the last step we recommend is gaps identification and improvement initiative formulation. But this is only if you're doing your study internally, or even if a third party does it, it is in contact with your company. For the report we did, this was actually a step that the readers have to do. They have to identify their own gaps and formulate their improvement initiatives. So we kept on discussing about secondary benchmarking study, its benefits, but I would like to move on now and discuss practically which are the differences between deploying a secondary benchmarking study or a primary benchmarking study. On the screen now, you can see a benchmarking diagram, which has the type of the study and the type of the benchmarking chosen. So let's see, then we have primary and secondary, and then performance is the first one we have there. It refers to comparing measurable performance. It's mostly related to products or services of competing organizations. So performance results are almost in all cases presented in annual reports. So it makes it easier to gather the data and analyze it, especially within your own industry. So for this particular type of benchmarking, I believe that secondary study could be easily deployed and could be very helpful. Now you can see an arrow going from secondary study to strategic benchmarking. Why is this also easy to deploy, and why is there also easy to gather data for this type of benchmarking? Well, because most organizations have their vision, mission, their strategic objectives listed either on their websites or in their reports. So hence, it is also, again, easy to at least gain a big picture, to at least know what they're doing to and how they're competing in the market and what is their competitive advantage. You can gain at least a glimpse. It will not be exactly, let's say, they will not write their entire strategy there, but you will gain a glimpse. You can gather some data. So also strategic benchmarking can be done throughout a secondary study. But why isn't there an arrow going from secondary benchmarking to process? It's simply because no organization will list their process maps, especially if they're core processes, anywhere. You won't find their core process listed in any report or on their website. So it will be very hard for you to find information. And for this type of benchmarking, we recommend you to contact the company you want to benchmark against directly, create a partnership, and try a primary study. Moreover, I would like to present to you four approaches, four main approaches when talking about benchmarking. One is internal, and the other three are external approaches. Of course, obviously, if you want to benchmark your division against another division from the inside of your company, there is no need to conduct a secondary benchmarking study, in my opinion, since you can contact directly your colleagues. In this case, doing a secondary benchmarking and trying to find the data available online for that particular division or department will be waste of time, waste of resources, and it might not bring you as many benefits as just talking directly to your colleagues and see how they're doing things in order to improve your division as well. When talking about competitive approach, we're moving on to external approaches. So when talking about the competitive approach, given the common rules and regulations you have, because this will be deployed within your industry with your direct competitors, means that some metrics measured could be the same, or even I would actually say most of the metrics measured would be the same. And we can easily conduct a secondary benchmarking study. In this case, we can avoid asking for information directly from your competitors, which might be reluctant in giving you that particular information. You avoid asking them more than you should, or things that they don't want to share with their competition. You reduce costs for not deploying primary benchmarking, which might need a survey or which might need you to go on site visits and so on. And you will ensure not breaking any legal or ethical boundary, since all the data is posted online by your competitors. So I think that in this case, a secondary benchmarking study would be the easiest approach and the one that that actually works and will show you exactly what you want to see if we're talking about performance or strategic benchmarking. The third one, which is functional benchmarking, refers to comparing with similar or identical practices within the same or similar function, but outside your immediate industry. So, for instance, you will benchmark your, let's say, distribution within. If you're a gas company, you will benchmark distribution outside your immediate industry, but still within the utility. So you might you might go to an electricity distribution company and benchmark with them. This is also easily to be deployed by using a secondary study, since the metrics are similar as well as the practices. Another benefit of a secondary study in this situation is that it helps you reduce the costs and reduce the time spent on this particular task, just as it was the case with the competitive one. Now, lastly, the generic benchmarking refers to comparisons done between unrelated business processes or functions, which can be practiced in similar ways regardless of the industry. So it's really broad. It's a really broad approach. And given how broad this approach is, conducting a secondary benchmarking, from my opinion, is really hard, and it will be limited to strategy only, as performance benchmarking is not feasible, since surely the metrics are really different. We're talking about completely different industries and so on. But although this is the one that fosters the most innovation, and it's the most innovative approach, this would be a bit time-consuming, complicated to put in practice, and I would not recommend beginner teams to start with this particular type of approach. I would recommend to start maybe with the competitive or functional to see how it goes and move to generic afterwards. However, you need to know from the beginning that will involve more time and more resources. Now, we have discussed where secondary benchmarking can be used and why it can or cannot be used in relation to benchmarking types and approaches. Let's move to challenges and benefits of deploying a secondary benchmarking initiative. Now, I would have another poll, another, let's say, exercise for you. And let's check the results and see, discuss them a bit, and then I would like you to answer a question. So our results are the first one, the ones in gray. We would like to compare with one of the other 4 call centers, and we would like to choose the best benchmarking partners. What I want you to see from here is mostly the context, and it will make sense. The exercise will make sense with the benefits later on. So we have the number of employees, the time spent on call handling, the percentage of calls that are resolved from the first call, how utilized, well, agent utilization, revenue per successful call, and the call drop rate. If we check the numbers, I would like you to take a glimpse of this and tell me which one would you choose as your benchmarking partner if you were to gather this data from a secondary benchmarking study. So just by looking at the context and at the results, I would like you to give me an answer. Just what would you choose? Now, Andre, if you can please start the second poll, please. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for answering. And everyone who voted for call center number 4. So call center number 4 has 5,672 employees, while our only has almost 1,000. They have a slightly better call handling time than us. They do have a very good first call resolution rate, almost the same agent utilization, of course, a very good revenue per successful call, and a very good call drop rate. However, and is also from the same geographical area as we are. However, I would not recommend you to go with this call center particularly, because the difference of the number of employees is really, really, really high. And this is what I wanted to emphasize, that when discussing a secondary benchmarking, having the context and checking the context in which that particular organization is operating is very important. For instance, here it does have one of the best results for what you want to improve, which is first call resolution, call drop rate, and even revenue, because in the end it is about increasing the revenue, but it has many more employees than you have, and it's really hard to know how they operate only from the data. So only from this particular data, I would go with call center number 2, as it has almost the same employees. It operates in the same geographical area, so they should have more or less the same regulations, but it has a better call handling time than us. It surely has a really good first call resolution rate. It has almost double the revenue and almost double a better call drop rate. So only by having the data, I would go with this one, as it has the same context, and you can make sure that more or less they are operating in the same way, and you can find the gaps very very easily, and you know for sure that the gaps are actually are reliable, let's say. And going back to the first poll, you all answered correctly. The correct answer was actually data collection. This is the most challenging part or phase of a secondary benchmarking study, and there are some explanations for this. For instance, data availability. This is one of the biggest issues. Maybe your partners, the ones you chose or you found as relevant, don't measure the same KPI, or even they don't report it. I mean, they might have the data, they might measure it, but they don't report it, so you don't find it online. Now, it might be the case, as it was in our case, that the data available was not in the language, in English, or in a language easily translatable. So data can be considered as not available in this case. A second one would be unstandardized KPIs or unstandardized data. For instance, KPIs can be written differently than you have them written, and you have to use the symbols or standardize them. For instance, make them more clear, and make sure that all KPIs referring to the same thing have the same name. Otherwise, it will be really hard, especially if you're working with big data. As well as unstandardized data, you might have different units of measurement for your KPIs, and you will have to compute them before analyzing the data. Moreover, another challenge is the terminology. As I said, you might understand the same thing, but express it in different ways. So once once you make sure that two KPIs with different names refer to the same thing, then you will have to change the name of all and make sure you have basically the same name for a KPI that refers to the same thing in your database. And lastly is lack of context. As I showed you before, having the context and having at least the number of employees or the geographical area in order to make sure you're benchmarking correctly is important when talking about the secondary benchmarking. For a primary one, you can get the context out of the people you're interviewing or out of when you're deploying the site visit. But for a secondary, you only have the data. So you have to make sure you put the context as well. For instance, what we did in our report was to have company profiles for each company analyzed at the end of the report so that our clients can see where that particular company operates geographically wise, how many employees they have, and details that can help them make sure they are benchmarking themselves correctly against that particular company. Moving on to benefits. One of the biggest benefits of a secondary benchmarking, as you've seen, is that less resources are needed, money-wise, time-wise, and people-wise. You don't have to go to site visits, you don't have to contact a lot of people and make sure they want to participate or not. This will also help you gain some time. The only resource you need is, of course, employees that will search for the data, that will create the database and analyze it. But it is fewer than in the case of a primary benchmarking. Next, it is very useful if the research is based especially on data usually reported in annual or sustainability reports or even financial reports. If you're going to benchmark your some metrics that usually all companies report in those reports, it's going to be very useful and very easy to deploy because all you have to do is download the report and check for those particular metrics. Now, it can be the basis of improvement measures, as we already proved, although usually people consider secondary, as I said, not very important, and they think that only on primary benchmarking you can base your improvement measures. And lastly, it is an innovation driver. Although, again, people do consider usually that a secondary benchmarking study doesn't have this kind of benefit. Well, it actually does. It can be an innovation driver only by looking at the data and showing seeing the gaps. If you enjoyed the webinar, or if you have any other comments, suggestions that you would like to discuss, or if you would like to take part in a primary benchmarking study which we are planning on deploying, then please let us know. And I would like now to move on to reviewing our webinar today. Now, the comparison phase is the most challenging one, as you already agreed. We have discussed the methodology and each step the KPI Institute chose for its secondary benchmarking study. The secondary benchmarking is mostly recommended for performance and strategy, and less for process benchmarking. Data availability and standardization could be main issues you will have to deal with, and you should also remember that it needs less resources and can be used for improvement. So To answer the question, I do believe that secondary benchmarking study is worth the time. Now I would like Andre to see if we have any questions. Or...
Thank you very much for your presentation, Alina. And yes, we do have a question and an answer, a reply, better said, to your earlier point on the exercise with call centers. So when discussing about which call center to choose to partner with, the question is, shouldn't the decision be based on a person's specific objective behind a benchmarking exercise? Like, shouldn't someone have a specific objective which they follow rather than looking at all the data? And the reply to the data was that the number of employees does not equate necessarily to the number of call center agents. So total employees with the type of call handling that a few centers there had was actually quite good. So
Okay.
coming back to the
So
question,
yes.
again, shouldn't someone who wants to partner up with a certain call center, shouldn't they have a specific objective which they should follow instead of looking at all possible data?
Okay. So for the objective, this was discussed in the beginning of the webinar in the planning phase. Of course, you need to have an objective, and I'm sorry if I didn't mention it, but our objective was to increase revenue, actually to increase customer satisfaction and increase revenue as well. So we were mostly interested in that, and it says here. I'm sorry. I just wanted to show you this again. So it says here the number of employees, but if you look at this, it says call center. So it was referring to number of employees only for the call center, not for the entire company. So we were actually this was for the reply, and um, for the question. For instance, if this particular one of the customer, the call center will have as an objective to reduce the call handling time, then they would surely benchmark with call center number 5 because they have the least call handling time, the lowest. If your objective, as it was in our case, and I'm really sorry I didn't mention, was to increase customer satisfaction and increase the revenue, then I do consider we need to also take into consideration the number of employees. Because if you want to increase customer satisfaction, then you're looking at the first call resolution rate. They don't have to call many times. They call once, you solve their problem, and their satisfaction increases. And you cannot compare your first call resolution rate when you have only 900 people answering phone calls with 5,000. Now, we also should take into consideration the number of customers they have, or let's say the rate between employees or agents and customers. But this would be quite hard to find information for a secondary study. I hope I did answer your question.
All right, that was what we had until now. We'll wait a couple more minutes to see if anyone
Okay,
has any other question.
of course.
Well, seeing that there seem to be no more questions, that brings us to the end of our webinar. Alina, do you have any last words for our listeners?
Um, yes, thank you all for joining. I hope you enjoyed the webinar today, and I will be expecting you in 2 weeks for the fifth part of the series about benchmarking. Thank you.
Thank you very much once again. The KPI Institute appreciates your interest in the secondary benchmarking Is It Worth the Time webinar. Follow our websites and our social media channels to find out more details and to subscribe to our next webinar, Systems for Measuring KPIs, Real-World Examples and Best Practices, which will be held on the 16th of August by Andrea Minelli, a business research analyst at the KPI Institute. Also, if you're interested in getting a certification granted by the KPI Institute on vital areas within the performance management discipline, you can explore our scheduled courses on marketplace.kpiinstitute.org. Thank you again for your participation and have a nice day.